Hi, hello, welcome once again to my channel. My name is Daria, I'm a queer cellist. I love to talk about everything that I find interesting in classical music, and I ultimately want to create a community around classical music that's inclusive and self-aware. If that sounds like it might be your jam, feel free to subscribe to my channel or even just to have a look around. Today's video especially is one which I think really embodies that spirit. I am so thrilled to finally be making a video about Florence Beatrice Price. And I hope that by the end of it you will be inspired to go and seek out her music, because otherwise you will seriously be missing out. Most of my information comes from this book. The Heart of a Woman, The Life and Music of Florence B. Price, written by Ray Linda Brown. I really recommend it to anyone even remotely interested in Florence Price. It isn't just a very detailed biography, but provides great insights into the African-American artist community of the early 20th century in general, and it spends a lot of time specifically on the hardships that Florence Price faced as a Black woman and single mother. You can find all other resources I used down in the description below. Finally, a quick disclaimer. I will be using some terms to describe Black people which were in common use at the time, both by Black and white people, but which today can be controversial or even still very offensive. I will only be using these terms as parts of quotes or acronyms, but I wanted to make sure to signpost this at the beginning nonetheless. And finally, the following content warnings apply for this video. Discussions of white supremacy, violent racism, and domestic abuse. And now, let's get to it. Florence Price was born as Florence Beatrice Smith on April 9, 1887 in Little Rock, Arkansas. Her father, James H. Smith, wasn't just a dentist, he was the first Black dentist in Little Rock, as well as one of the most esteemed activists in its Black community. Her mother, Florence Irene Gulliver Smith, was a very capable businesswoman who, in fact, owned her own business independently from her husband, and additionally was a very well-trained musician. That's quite the remarkable family to start out with. At the time, Little Rock was known as a safe haven for Black people, a city which promised a life of relative comfort and safety for a growing Black middle and upper class. I say relative because this still was the segregated South of the United States. This upper class, or Black aristocracy as it was sometimes called, was made up of two types of families. The old families were former slaves who were born in or around the city. The new families, on the other hand, were people who relocated to the city from the outside, and they were made up of highly skilled and educated individuals, Florence's father being one of them. Make no mistake, the large majority of Black people in Little Rock lived in poverty, as is to be expected, everything considered. However, the presence of a small but powerful and affluent upper class within their community made a huge difference to everyone. These people understood that the most powerful tool they could use to resist and rise within the deeply racist society of the time was education. And so they strove to provide as many Black children of all backgrounds in Little Rock as possible with the best education that their money could buy. This is why Little Rock had a high school for Black children built and funded entirely by its Black community. The white populace and administration of the South did not believe that Black people needed any kind of higher education, and so zero public funding would have been available to build an entire school. This is why Florence received a very thorough education from the get-go, and because her mother was herself a very skilled singer and pianist, this included comprehensive music lessons. Florence received piano lessons from the age of 4, and some of her earliest compositions date back to that time as well. After school, she enrolled at the New England Conservatory of Music in Boston, where she graduated with not 1, but 2 degrees. Highly unusual for any student, let alone for a young Black woman. One was in piano teaching, the other was in organ performance, and her studies also included tuition in composition. So once again, Florence Price was in the right place at the right time. This is because Boston wasn't just one of the cultural hubs of the country, but it had a special interest in American composers, which was unusual at a time where the classical music scene in the US was utterly dominated by German, Austro-German composers. We'll get back to this a bit later. As you can probably already tell, Florence was a highly skilled pianist and organ player. Both skills served her well throughout her life. Most of her compositions are for the piano, among them a concerto in one movement. And as an organ player, she was able to earn extra income later on in her life by playing not just in churches, but in cinemas and theatres as well. This helped her get through the Great Depression and other hard times during her life. Having finished her education in 1906, Florence at first returned to Little Rock to teach, as it was almost an unspoken law among young black people to give back to the community that had provided them with a much better start in life than they otherwise would have had. For Florence, that calling was even stronger, as her father especially was involved in all sorts of social causes in Little Rock. She was a highly capable piano and music teacher, and no doubt a huge role model for her students and for the entire community. The Little Rock she returned to, though, was quite different from the one she had left. By this time, Jim Crow laws were in full effect across the southern United States, which means that white legislators had made segregation not just complete, but legal, and the white population was only too happy to comply. Even so, Florence still had better chances to gain employment here than in any city up north, and she knew that. Florence Price remained in the South for a couple of decades. She left Little Rock for Atlanta, Georgia in 1910, where she became head of the music department at Clark University, a historically black university. Again, a huge achievement for her as a black woman. Her position meant that she was composer, artist in residence, and music teacher all at the same time, which gave her both massive influence over the music curriculum and plenty of opportunities to perform. She also took great care to introduce her students to other contemporary black composers and musicians, which in turn gave those artists much needed opportunities to perform in public, as they were excluded from the vast majority of music halls in the country. In 1912, Florence married Thomas J. Price, who at the time was a successful attorney, and the family settled back in Little Rock. She abandoned her teaching career at Clark University and instead became a piano and music teacher in the city. But she began to take composing more seriously as well. Inspired by her profession, she wrote a large number of so-called study pieces for the piano, rather than relying on the educational material provided by others. However, Florence had greater ambitions as well. The 1920s saw her submitting a number of small-scale piano pieces to various competitions, and during that time she did win several awards. And this was the beginning of her career as a well-known and respected composer. However, being one of the most influential black families in Little Rock did nothing to spare the Prices from the brutality of white supremacy in the South. The murder of a white child in 1927, allegedly by a black man, was only one of too many incidents that the white mob took as an excuse to lynch black people. This time they wanted an eye for an eye, so the retaliation would have been to kill a black child. And as Raylinda Brown writes, the apparent victim was to be Florence Price's youngest daughter, Florence Louise. The police obviously were going to do nothing to protect the family, and so they had no choice but to flee. They went to Chicago, Illinois, as did so many other black people who just could not bear the situation in the South any longer, in what is now known as the Great Migration. Chicago became especially attractive to black creatives in the 1910s and 20s, and Florence Price would greatly benefit from the artist networks and organizations that formed in this city. She joined as many of them as she possibly could and took active roles, for example, in the National Association for Negro Musicians, or NANM for short. First, however, she had to fight through additional hardships. The Great Depression in 1929 rendered her husband basically unemployable, and he brutally took out his anger and frustrations on his family, to the point where he not just threatened to kill Florence, but actually attempted it. As a result, she threw him out of their home, and a few months later the divorce was finalized. So now Florence wasn't just a black musician and composer trying to make a living after the Great Depression, she also had to do it as a single mother. Florence Price soldiered on. The same month the divorce was final, January 1931, she began to work on her first symphony, the largest piece she had attempted to date. So let's talk about her music in general. From the beginning, Florence combined the music of her African American heritage, so spirituals, the songs and dances of slaves, as well as certain harmonies and scales, with the traditional European classical training that she received. Some of her early works include pieces titled Three Negro Dances, Dances in the Cane Breaks, or several numbered pieces all titled Fantaisie Nègre, all for the piano. So as you can see, Florence was entirely unapologetic about leaning into this part of her heritage, which at the time was a bold move for any black composer. She refined this method of composing throughout her whole life until she developed a musical language that wasn't just a combination of black and white traditions, but entirely her own. We see this progression especially when we compare her first symphony in E minor to her third in C minor. The third movement of her first symphony is titled Juba Dance, after the folk dance Pattern Juba, which features strong syncopated rhythms. This piece by far isn't the only one of hers that features this particular dance. In fact, Florence wrote the following, referring to her third symphony this time.
In all of my works, which have been done in the sonata form with Negroid idiom, I have incorporated Juba as one of the several movements because it seems to me no more impossible to conceive of Negroid music devoid of spiritualistic theme on one hand than the strongly syncopated rhythms of the Juba on the other.
The difference between the first and third symphonies lies in the way she translates this dance into European classical orchestra language. In the E minor, the first symphony, the rhythmic element stays firmly within the percussion section and the lower strings, which means it's always there, always audible. The C minor symphony, however, lacks this firm foundation. Instead, it is merely implied through additional percussion instruments which accentuate rhythmic impulses. So it's as if she buried the heart of this movement in its musical soil and let the music grow out of that, so that it kind of hovers, that its spirit kind of hovers over the music without ever actually being visible. That takes a lot of skill. This first symphony marked a massive breakthrough in Florence's career. It not only won the grand prize of $750 in a major competition in 1932, which, by the way, in today's money is $14,874, but it also drew the interest of the chief conductor of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. A year later, that same orchestra performed Florence Price's symphony, which made her the first African-American woman who had a symphony performed by one of the United States' leading orchestras. Just savor that sentence. Don't get me wrong, even before that, Florence was widely respected and revered within the black community. Her friends and supporters included eminent composers and musicians such as William Grant Still, Margaret Bonds, and Marian Anderson. The latter performed some of Price's songs all the way in Russia. But the fact that she worked so hard and so tirelessly and managed to break through the relentless racism and sexism to become known even among the white classical establishment, that is what blows my mind. Plus, even more so than today, the American classical music scene was almost entirely focused on German romantic music, so we are talking Brahms, Wagner, Bruckner, Beethoven, etc. There was very little interest in promoting contemporary American music, especially if it wasn't written in that specific tradition. Yeah, good old white supremacy has its fingers in many, many pies. So that's another barrier that Florence Price had to break through again and again. The sheer tenacity to get to this place did take a toll on Florence's health, however. She was generally described as a very reserved, even shy woman, which is actually very likely one of the reasons why the white establishment was inclined to accept her in the first place. She presented herself as modest, soft-spoken, genteel. She had to, because otherwise she would have been hit with one of the many negative and harmful stereotypes about black women. At the same time, however, she had to do what every creative to this day has to do, whether they like it or not. She had to relentlessly promote herself, something which she absolutely abhorred. Big same. Because Florence Price was such a private woman, we don't have a diary or even many letters to look back on to try and understand her emotional world. We do, however, have several letters which she wrote to conductor Sergei Kusevitsky, a name which will be very familiar to the double bass players among you. She wrote to him repeatedly with the goal of having him premiere her third symphony with the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and I think the final of those letters, written in 1943, sums up the predicament of her life perfectly.
My dear Dr. Kusevitsky, unfortunately, the work of a woman composer is preconceived by many to be light, frothy, lacking in depth, logic, and virility. Add to that the incident of race. I have colored blood in my veins, and you will understand some of the difficulties that confront one in such a position. My own detestable but seemingly unconquerable shyness has not served me to gain widespread hearing. The few times I have been able to overcome this handicap in the past and manage to get a score examined, I have been met with the most gratifying results, as you will note in the comments of critics quoted in my folder. Now that my duties connected with caring for parents and children have been lifted from my shoulders, I do so want to make tangible progress and to get examined and performed some of my accumulated scores. In keeping with one last promise to myself that I shall no longer hang back, I am now being so bold as to address you. I ask no concessions because of race or sex, and am willing to abide by a decision solely on the worth of my work. Will you be kind enough to examine a score of mine? Very truly yours, Florence B. Price.
She never received a response from the man. And that's how the final decade of her life passed as well. Florence's efforts weakening as she tried again and again to overcome societal barriers. She did continue to compose. Some of her most poignant art songs are from that time period, and her reputation also continued to grow, make no mistake. However, and again, this is something that all of us creatives know, you can't pay the bills with reputation alone. Still, Florence was set to travel to Europe for the first time in 1953 to receive an award in Paris and to then go sightseeing in France and England. However, the trip never happened. Florence Price died on June 3rd, 1953, after succumbing to an illness of the heart that had plagued her since she was a baby. She is buried in Lincoln Cemetery in Blue Island, Illinois, in an unmarked grave. It wasn't until 2018, when a large part of scores that had been thought lost turned up again, that the white classical mainstream began to show renewed interest in Florence Price. Yes, I am choosing my words very deliberately here. It is wrong to say that Florence Price's music was ever forgotten and had to be rediscovered. The truth is that the white classical establishment wasn't interested in her in the first place. As soon as she wasn't around anymore to relentlessly promote herself, her music was dropped. And frankly, that is very much our loss. Florence Price's music is nothing short of majestic, and it has an energy and a dignity to it that I hadn't heard in classical music before. And honestly, I would vastly prefer hearing her symphonies every week in the concert halls than the same old stale reruns of Bruckner, Wagner or Beethoven. In that spirit, I've put together a playlist that features a large selection of her works, ranging from songs to solo piano music, all the way to her symphonies, and I strongly recommend that you listen to all of them. Your ears, mind, and heart will thank you for it. Furthermore, I will link as many physical recordings as I possibly can for those of you who still buy CDs, like me. I also want to reiterate that I got nearly all of my information from Ray Linda Brown's biography, and honestly, I barely even managed to scratch the surface of all the research that went into that book. If you're even remotely interested in Florence Price and her life and times, I strongly, strongly recommend that you buy that book. Finally, there's another book about her in the works, and it will be co-written by Douglas W. Shadle and Dr. Samantha Ege, both of them eminent scholars on Florence Price. And Dr. Samantha Ege actually released an album of Florence Price's solo piano music very recently, and it may well be my favorite classical music CD that I own. And that's it. I hope you learned something new today and that you now feel inspired to explore the world of Florence Price's music. For me, learning about her has been an absolute privilege, and I'm really looking forward to making in-depth videos about some of her pieces as well. And I would also like to make more videos about composers of color, living or dead. So if you have any suggestions as to who I should make a video about next, please let me know in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe and stay tuned. Her mother, who has a very long name that I keep forgetting. Nelson. Hi. What's your opinion on this? Are you about to go have a snack? Nelson. This was the beginning of her career as a well-known and respected composer. Brain, please, please, work with me here. If you could see Nelson's face right now, he hates that I'm clapping so much. He's like, why? Why do you do this? That the white classical establishment